Hi, David. It's wonderful meeting you this morning. Um, just to introduce David to the audience, people who are in this Cocharia Coaching Colloquium webinar, David Clutterbuck is a co-founder of the European Mentoring and Coaching Council. He has written over 65 books. He is a professor at 3 universities, including the Oxford Brookes, and he is an acknowledged authority in the field of coaching and mentoring. I've personally interacted with him several times, and it's my pleasure to introduce him today to you. And David, in case you want to add something more about yourself, what is important for this audience, which is primarily coaches and executives who would like to become coaches, please carry on.
I think I just have to say that being a coach is one of the greatest privileges that one can have in life. It's an opportunity to develop oneself as much as to help develop other people. So that's part of what makes it such good fun.
Fantastic, David. Thank you very much indeed. So if you'd just like to sort of tell the audience about what your topic is, and then you can continue with your presentation. And if there's anything in between that you would like me to comment on, just let me know. So I won't stand between you and the audience. All yours.
Do come in whenever you like. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is goals. There's a lot of assumptions about goals and coaching. And what we find is that, or what started all this out was the old question of what's the evidence that coaches really need to have lots of goals, or to make their clients have lots of goals. And when we started to dig into this, we basically found that the evidence was not very strong, and it was a much more complex picture. So that's what I'm going to present, that complex picture, so that as coaches, we begin to understand that that goals are something that we can work with in very different ways than is normally taught on a coaching course.
Okay.
So shall I take you through my slide set?
Yeah, please do, David. Yeah.
Okay, can you see the slides?
Yeah, I can see the slides. They are fine. I can see the first one. I can see the second one now. Yeah.
So interestingly, the roots of the word goal, when we look it up in the dictionary, is it's a boundary or limit. And I don't think many people out there, I'm sure in your practice, Ram, you would not expect to set limits or boundaries on your clients. We're really there to open up the boundaries. So the word itself comes with a lot of baggage and problems as well. And if we take it a little bit further, if we look at the difference between SMART goals and goal models and goal-oriented coaching models, what we see is that well, you've got SMART is a process for goal setting, so specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. Whether it's a good model, we'll look at in a minute. But GROW is not a process for goal setting. GROW is a process for goal management. And goals, reality, opportunities, and will. I always talk about. I always have to laugh because I actually sort of talk about GROW standing for Get Rich on Waffle, but that's another story. So then we look at people who really propose that we should be really setting lots of goals or pushing goals. They point to the evidence from Locke and Latham and other people, the goal theorists, which demonstrate quite clearly that that if you are working towards a goal, then and you can envision it, that actually provides you motivation to continue doing it. So there's a positive cycle here about setting a goal actually allowing you to improve your performance. And sometimes, in order to make goals work, we've got to make them quite concrete. So that's where SMART, the specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound, comes in. But there's also some work that suggests that goals don't have to be that tight, that you can set a learning goal as well, and that can be highly effective. And Miles Downey, the writer on coaching, has done quite a lot on this, and so has Anthony Grant in Australia. And basically what the classic literature on coaching says is that goals have to have clarity. They've got to have an element of challenge. So they've got to stretch you a bit. they've got to be committed to them. There has to be some kind of feedback loop so that you know how well you're doing towards them. And interestingly, if goals are too simple, or if the task itself is too simple, then it doesn't work as well as if the task has some level of complexity. So there's a balance here between being too simple and too complex. So that's what the guys who promote goal setting for. But other people who've been looking at goals in more recent years find that actually there are some significant downsides to an overemphasis on goals, and particularly SMART goals. So there's been a number of studies of the mentality of people that climb Everest and get near the top, and then find that it's time to turn back. They haven't got time to reach the summit, but they spend all this money and all this effort. They've trained for months, perhaps years to get there. And the goal drives them to say, I know it's dangerous, but I'm going to go to the top. And a high proportion of those people die up on the top of the mountain because it distorts the way that they think about risk. We know that SMART goals and very tight goals create unethical behavior. So when people are they've got a target to achieve, and they're going to miss it by, say, 5 or 10%, and they feel bad about that. What's the natural human reaction? It's to cheat. And so we find that it promotes unethical behavior. What tends to, when we've got a very specific goal in mind, we tend to be so focused on that goal, we missed all the other opportunities for learning in particular that lie alongside it. So our focus on the goal actually blinds us to other things that we could achieve and other things we could learn. And these other things here, it can, because of the ethicality issue and other issues, being overly focused on goals actually is quite corrosive to an organizational culture. We see one of the big problems in fear cultures, for example, cultures where there's a lot of fear. They tend to be associated with very, very high levels of challenging target setting. Also, people who have had goals set for them outside they're trying to achieve, they are less likely to achieve those goals than if those goals were set internally generated. So they were intrinsic goals rather than extrinsic goals. And of course, fear of success. But the fascinating thing that people sabotage themselves, and when people are faced with a challenging goal, very often people basically, even though they can do it, they sabotage themselves and they don't do it. It's a major derailer for executives in particular. And all of these things are reproduced with SMART goals, including another one, reduced attention. Well, these are all pretty much the same things we said on the previous slide. There's a study from 1991, so quite some time ago. But look at this: only a quarter of people are actually motivated by SMART goals. A quarter prefer to work to a vision. Others focus on the steps, and others actually get by perfectly well without planning at all. And the critical thing is that unless you're in that first group who are actually motivated by SMART goals, then you're likely to suffer from more stress, reduced motivation, less creativity, and lower resilience. So all of those things, actually, SMART goals aren't necessarily a good thing, although they can be sometimes. Here's a quote from Carl Weick. SMART goals dull responsiveness to the complex and emergent nature of an organizational life. They tend to take us away from thinking holistically. Here's some clients talking about their goals. I've already got all these organizations setting me goals. I don't need any more. I don't know what to address yet, and by the time I do, the goal that I set will be a thing of the past. If I can set SMART goals, don't you think I'd have sorted it? It's the messy, wicked issues I want to look at when I'm being coached. I know what my predecessor wants me to achieve through the coaching, but I disagree. That's his way, I have mine. So these are all different aspects of saying that goals are not necessarily the core of coaching. People can be coached without that great focus on goal. And some of the feedback we had from coaches, they push the sponsor's agenda because the sponsor often sets the goal or tells the client what the goal should be. So what happens is we automatically fall into this habit of saying, well, we've got to start off the whole relationship or the whole conversation with a goal. And what's the goal becomes the starting point. But it may not be if the client is ready for that yet. So all of these other things that we found, encouraging doing more in a society where doing less may be valuable, goals just push you to have one more thing they're going to work on. When actually what the person may need is to let go of things. Quite fascinating that the entrepreneur James Dyson has recently been reported in the English newspapers as saying he limits himself to 6 emails a day. And it's part of his doing less so that he can actually achieve more. And I think we tend to collude with people in trying to cram more and more into their days. So the need for all this clarity and all this control is more frequently the coaches than the clients. Sometimes the client isn't ready to set a goal at this stage. They want to understand the context, the situation much more, and then they may set a goal for themselves. And we've got 2 more items here. Goals can be used as an excuse to avoid the painfully beneficial. So we set a goal, and that allows us to focus on something which may not be really what that client needs to work on. And of course, if we've got a nice, comfortable goal set, we can see clearly where we're going. So as a coach, we can relax, we can let go. And we find that coaches who are overly goal-focused tend to be less client-focused. They listen less well to their clients. They're less attentive. Now, here's a survey from that my colleague David Veganson did, looking at coaches in 2 areas, in Europe and the States. And you can see there were 125 coaches in total, with some focus groups and lots of questionnaires as well. And these are the questions we asked them. I set goals for my coaches at the start of an assignment. The goals help us decide whether coaching is appropriately focused. The goals remain the same throughout the coaching.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I'm sorry, David. 1 second. My apologies. I'm sorry. Yeah, please continue.
That's right. I'm sure we can cut that bit out.
Yeah, I'll do that.
But yeah, you can see the questions here. I'm not going to go through them all, but these are the questions that were asked. And the results were very interesting. What we found is that if you were a European coach, the more experience you had, the less goal-oriented you became. And the shorter experience you had, the more that you tended to lean on goals and need to set goals for the client or with the client. We didn't see this with such a big difference in coaches in the United States, which was intriguing. And we don't have a full explanation for this, but we think it's probably because goal focus is drilled into coaches in the States much more than in other cultures, where the spirit of inquiry and the philosophy of coaching is much more open, but we don't know. And so we ask ourselves this critical question: how do we get this balance between goals as beneficial stimulants to performance and goals as what we might call addictive distractions? Because it's easy to fall into this being addicted to goals as a coach. So what the research tells us is this: that all of the studies we've seen in coaching practice, motivational theory, goal theory, all these big areas of research, they all tell us that goal setting and goal management are significantly more complex, more systemic, much more emergent, so they evolve with the conversation, than the standard coaching dogma allows for. It's much more complex than a simple grow model might make you think. So let's look at some of the evidence from coaching. Here's Sir John Whitmore, who recently died just this week. So it's sad. It's very sad to lose a good old friend. But he points out that grow should have been VRO for vision. A SMART goal was not what he had in mind at the beginning. And he says, it's one thing to establish a goal, but then do they remember it? Do other circumstances arise that cause that goal not to be the best goal? So even the guy who did more than any person in the world to promote the grow model is telling us that actually right at the beginning, we don't necessarily have to have that SMART goal. And here's a research report from HBR, Harvard Business Review. 200 executive coaches, all but a few of them said that goals changed while the coaching assignment went on. And the change shifted because as the client learned more about themselves and more about their context, they realized that what they wanted and what they needed was different from when they started. And indeed, that's the whole point of coaching, I would suggest, is to help people gain greater clarity about their internal and external worlds. And that makes it almost inevitable that the goals that they have for themselves will shift. So if we get stuck with that goal that and can't move from the goal, or overly focused on that goal we set at the beginning, we are probably not working to the best interests of the client. Now, we talk about coach maturity, and that we've done a lot of research looking at how coaches mature in their mindset. And we found 4 different kinds of mindset that coaches have. So if you're a beginner coach, and we call it a models-based coach, and you've got a model like the GROW model, and you basically do coaching to people. You make them, the client and their needs, fit the models that you have. So what we found there, that if you're working at that level, you lack a lot of confidence. You need a SMART goal because you've got to hang something on to, or you've got to hang on to something. When you get a bit more experienced in your process-based coach, so you've got a mixture of different models and perhaps more of a philosophy going on. So then you're doing coaching with somebody, you're allowing that coaching to happen together. So you can negotiate more of around the goals. And so you can give a bit more flexibility on the goals and perhaps hang back a bit before you plump for what the goal should be. The next level of maturity of coaches, we call it philosophy-based. Basically, these are people who are concentrating not on doing coaching to or doing coaching with somebody, but on being a coach. They have integrated their philosophy of coaching with their identity as a person. Now, and these people frequently, we find, are able to work without the necessity for setting goals until the client is fully ready for it, if the client is ever ready for it. Sometimes the issue is resolved without goal setting. And the most mature coaches that we've found, we call them is systemic eclectics. And these are people who basically hold the client while the client has the conversation that the client needs to have with themselves. So we say they hold the client while the client has this conversation they need to have with themselves. And we find that they are aware of goals, but they don't actually drive the goals at all. We find that we let the client actually reflect upon and evolve those goals through the conversation that they have with themselves, the questions the client generates for themselves. Now, these are obviously different skills at each level here, but we find that the more mature the coach is in their approach, the more likely they are to have a much more nuanced, much more flexible way of working with goals. And so, if we look at the negative side, if we overly focus on goals, they can basically get in the way of the client doing anything meaningful. They can basically be something that you set so that the client doesn't feel distracted or doesn't feel uncomfortable. So they can step back into their safe space. I'll set myself a goal for something that I feel comfortable about achieving. And goals can also be simply a crutch for the coach, so you don't really have to think about your coaching. Now, that's the negative side of it. But again, of course, we've seen there's lots of positive sides too. So here's a definition of goals. They're internal representations of desired states or outcomes. And I quite like this because it's very broad. It's something that we're able to, it's about visioning something that we want to achieve, either for ourselves or for others. But if we set goals far too early, then what tends to happen is we invest a lot in making those goals happen. And even if we now realize they're not the right goals, just the fact that we put all this effort in makes it harder for us to let go of them and to focus on goals that we really want. It's called the sunk cost trap, and we see it happening in businesses all the time when people keep pouring good money after bad money on things that should have, on projects that should have been killed. So we can see here that goals, there's lots of different ways we can look at goals. They can be something that's a long way in the future, that's distal or proximal, something that's next week or today. They can be things that are very specific about the outcomes, or they can be more visionary. I want things to be different, but I can't yet be clear about what that difference would be. They can be avoidance goals, so I want to stop doing things or get away from things. I want to lose all this worry, for example. Or they can be approach goals, that things you're trying to go towards, Things I want to be happier, for example. They can be goals which are around specific performance, or they're goals around learning. So, and we find that goals that are around learning or mastery tend to be to motivate people a lot more. They can be complementary with other goals that you have, or competing with other goals that you have. One of the big problems we find with many coaching clients is that the goals they set themselves are in conflict. So of course they're having trouble performing. The goal itself may be what we call self-concordant. So it may fit with the values that the other person has, or it may actually jar with the values they have. And frequently goals set by other people are discordant. They jar with the client's values. And goals can be generated by themselves or by other people. And again, goals you generate yourself tend to motivate you more than those other people set for you. So goals, the complexity, the multiple different kinds of goals is vast. And of course, how we get towards goals are affected by all these things, by how important we think it is, the motivation we have, whether we can accurately picture what's going on, whose goal it is. Is it my goal, or is it goal that's been foisted on me? How clearly can we vision what it should look like? Can we measure it? Will you know if you've got there? Is it actually a stable goal, something that's fixed, or is it actually constantly moving and evolving with the circumstances that we're in? Does it link closely to personal values? And what's happened in the past when you've gone after goals? Was the question here, have you got the habit of success in pursuing goals? If you haven't, you would often tend to give up before when the going gets hard. So all of those factors are there to consider when we're talking about the goals that our clients have. And we can see too, there's a hierarchy here. They've got higher order values. So the values that you have, the things that are really most important, your fundamental beliefs about and assumptions about the world. And if the goals align with those are great. But then you've got subordinate goals. And so that those are things that you want to achieve. And do those actually align, those subordinate goals, the other smaller things you want to achieve, do they actually line up with the goals which relate directly to your values? And again, finding that, helping the client really work this through and understand how their goals link together with their values is, I think, a fundamental part of the coach's role, and something to do before we ever get started on thinking about how is the person going to achieve those goals. A little bit of evidence from motivational theory. Richard Borzaitis' lovely work on when goals don't work. So we've got this values issue again, when they don't align with the client's values, when they're external self, and they activate what we call the ought self, not the ideal self. So if you're trying to be the best person you can, or you live up to your ideals, you're more likely to pursue the goals than things where you feel you are obliged to be like this or that. If they don't meet the learning style that you have, we all have a different mix of learning styles. If it doesn't fit the way you like to learn, you probably won't achieve the goal. When you don't understand what the task requires, he said, and most important one of all, does this goal actually trigger high levels of anxiety? Some anxiety is fine. A little bit of stress actually is good and motivating because it gives you excitement. But if that excitement becomes deep stress and fear, now you've set the stage for that goal not being achieved. And so Dickey and Ryan's recent research shows that the job of coaches is to try and stimulate as much as possible intrinsic motivation. So we're getting people to motivate themselves towards the goal, but also where other people are setting expectations of them, to internalize that, to bring that in, so that the extrinsic motivation from other people becomes part of your internal motivation. And we've got here Robert Keegan looking at implicit versus explicit goals. Goal setting may not just be something that happens in the opening moments of a coaching process, but is something that could itself evolve. And I would say from our evidence, it frequently does, in fact, most commonly does. And so technical versus adaptive coaching, as he calls them, is all about helping the client change the way that they think at a much deeper level. He talks about adding new software to the client's existing basic operating system. Sounds very technical, but essentially that's one way of doing it. But if you can help them to know themselves better, and help them to really change the way that they view the world, then the goals that they set will change as well. And I think we can simply say sometimes we just don't know what we want. We don't know what the goal is until we've got it, and then we have to decide whether we want it or not. So to a conclusion, we need to develop the skills as coaches to work with emergent goals and to allow emergent goals to be a core of our practice. So that means managing the expectations of both the client and any sponsor they may have. So to say your goal will probably evolve, and let's have reviews to actually look, not just review progress against goals, but to review and measure how have the goals evolved. Because if they haven't, we're probably not doing a good enough job on this. The feasibility of goals. Frequently people, when you go into goals, you find that they are just not going to work. Stretch goals, for example, only work when the person is riding on a tide of success already, so they have the motivation and the self-belief, and when they have the resources to make them work. In any other circumstance, stretch goals will demotivate the other person and reduce performance. The sponsor needs to be able to be open to negotiating goals as they need to change and recognizing the difference in context. And that means you've got to be pretty broad and flexible to begin with about goals, not trying to tie them down too fast. And that means that sometimes you've got to be able to sit there as a coach and just be comfortable that the goals haven't emerged yet. You don't know what the goal of the coaching is going to be, but you're confident that as you go on and as both you and the client really get to dig deep into the issue, then you will identify goals that are truly meaningful to them and truly achievable by them. And so if we're having this conversation with a goal, we want to ask them questions like this. So why are you presenting this goal? Why are you presenting it now and not in the past or in the future? Is it really your goal, or is it somebody else's goal that you're having to adopt? Is it a subset of a big goal, or is it a number of connected goals that we need to pull apart? Does it really align with your values, what you think is important, and your personal identity? And what's it going to replace if you achieve this goal? Or put another way, if you're going to achieve this goal, what are you going to have to stop doing and change in your environment to make it possible to do so? And so just to wrap all this up, to say that coaching and mentoring, frequently we see them described as goal conversations. What I've just done in this presentation is to challenge that deeply. Coaching and mentoring are learning conversations, and goals are a small part of making that learning conversation work. And we need, as coaches, to have a much more nuanced, much clearer idea around how beneficial it is, perhaps sometimes not to run with the first goal that somebody comes out with, but to help them really think through, is that the right goal for you? And how will we get to the goal that's going to be most beneficial for you in your circumstances and in your environment now?
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much, David. I think it's one of the most thought-provoking inputs that I have heard on this particular subject. And I would like to start with almost the last comment that you have, and in the interest of time and allowing the audience to ask questions, I'll just limit myself to 3 or 4 questions, which themselves may be pretty long, actually. You said beautifully that coaching is about learning conversation. It's not about goal conversations. Now, one of the things that I have experienced both in my coach training as well as in coaching itself is this, in a sense, the dilemma that happens when the clients are not ready with their goals, as it were, or certainly not with SMART goals. And as coaches, we go by stuff that we have been taught in terms of credentials, agreement, goal setting, goal clarifications, and so on. and exactly what you said happens. The question is really, is the coach being coach-centric in terms of looking for these specific goals, or is there any purpose of the client being served? And combined with that, other research study that you talked about, David Wilkinson and you, between the difference of the US and European coaches, that the US coaches are far more goal-centric than the Europeans, who are much more inquiry-based. Combining these two, what's been your own experience? I just would like to have personal views over and above what you've said.
I have found in my own journey as a coach, excuse me, that a lot of it's to do with how confident we become that we don't need to steer the conversation. That we can truly, we're taught that we should allow the client to steer the conversation, but in reality, what happens is most coaches do steer the conversation far more than they want to admit to themselves. Say we are not directive. There is no such thing as a non-directive coaching conversation. The moment that you decide you are going to ask a particular question, you have just made a decision on behalf of the client. And I think that it's so this myth that we are non-directive, this myth that we have to that the client is in charge of everything is it's just not true. So when we really learn to attend to our client and we do hand over responsibility to them, we can very quickly they can very quickly come to a view as to, is the time right for them to give to want to set a very specific goal? Is it maybe something about setting a broad sense of purpose? What is the point of this relationship? Well, the point of this coaching relationship is that I want to feel that I am more in charge of my career. Now, in all of the work on goal setting, that's not really a goal because it's too vague. And yet it's a great starting point for a coach to be able to say, okay, so let's look at all the understanding here. Tell me about your career up to this stage. When did you feel in control of it, and when did you feel less in control of it? What is it that's making you feel less in control, and that you're not in control of your career now? What would achieving greater control do for you? And indeed, what would actually changing the way that you think about being in control do for you, so that you are actually able to free yourself from the need to be in control, etc., etc. So the more that we actually explore the world behind the presented goal, the more that we can actually help that client think through what they really want. And it's rather like the coaching conversation. So much of of what's written about the coaching conversation is about the decision about creating the solution. And we have solutions focused coaching, which is very definitely about coming to a conclusion, a solution. Even though actually what we do know is that very often the solutions, the solution creating part of the conversation usually happens after the coaching conversation in the head of the client while they're on their own. But if we're trying to drive the process ourselves, we start to lose it with the client, or we take away from the client this ability to think things through for themselves. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I'm trying to link it to something else that you covered about the intrinsic motivation, and somewhere you talked about the transcendence. And I remember, and you also mentioned about John Whitmore's statement that it should have been the VROW model rather than the GROW model. And I remember in one of the interviews that I heard of him saying that amongst many people that I have coached, everybody always started with material benefits, material goals. And as I dug deeper and the coaching conversation proceeded, it always was that what they were looking for was a way that they could be of use to society, how they could serve society. And in some ways, what you said about that intrinsic vision-oriented goal, as it were, and is that what you call by saying that it's a transcendence coaching? Could you say something about that?
Yeah, I think when we look at fully mature individuals, particularly using the Keegan model of stages of adult development, when somebody becomes a truly mature person, their perception of the way that they interact with the world around them changes quite radically. And they see themselves and the world around them as something, as two things or two contexts that are constantly influencing each other. They're influencing the world, and the world is influencing them. We are constantly evolving together. And I think if we can step back and see the goals in that way, that what's important to us is will be an evolutionary process. Then we don't have to be tied down to setting specific goals all the time. We can look upon goals as simply a stepping stone to something else, and we may not know what that something else is, but we have the reassurance that we are heading in a direction that will be beneficial to us and to the wider world. And so I think the more that we can place ourselves in the context of society and the bigger world, the easier it is for us to see the contribution that we make and to set much wider, more humane goals.
Absolutely. And in that context, again, if I refer back to something that you said, which resonated for me about this example of the Mount Everest, the risky goals and unethical behavior resulting from that. So the focus of coaching, especially of the coach trying to get the client to focus very specifically on something that benefits them. In your experience, does it lead more often to this kind of risky goal setting and unethical behavior?
I think the biggest danger is where the goals come from outside, and it's ill-considered, where the goal is set irrespective or without real thought about the impact of those goals. And so the goal becomes the reason for being, as opposed for serving the higher purpose that we just started talking about. So it becomes an end in itself rather than a part of a longer term process of evolving into some of evolution of the individual or evolution of society.
Yeah. In that sense, as you said somewhere during this presentation, goal setting is the beginning, and it certainly should not be the end. And where it leads to a good coach working with a client who's reflective, it could lead anywhere. It depends on the intrinsic motivation of the client and where the person's vision takes them to. So any final words, David, to wrap up the session?
Well, I think it's quite hard for a coach who's been brought up on setting very specific goals with clients right at the beginning and sticking to those goals to let go of it, to break the habit. But our advice has always been to just do it gradually, just experiment with it. Have conversations with people who are not clients where you're able to practice just allowing goals to emerge and evolve and trace what happens to the goals. So that's one thing that can be very practical. And also building in review sessions, learning review sessions within coaching assignments. So we're not just looking at the progress that's been made in terms of a particular performance goal, but we're looking at the learning that's taken place within the client and within their system as well, which is equally important. So how's that learning been transferred into the other people and the systems around them? And that's the point when we can say, okay, as part of this learning, what have we learned about the goal itself? And that question almost always gets the client to think, what have you learned about your, I would always ask, what have you learned about yourself? And what have you learned about your goal as a result of the conversations that we've had? And that's the point when people will frequently say, I now see it at least partially differently. And that gives me much wider options in terms of what I can do in order to achieve either the goal I originally set, or a modified version of that goal that actually is more congruent with the person that I wish to be.
Absolutely. That's absolutely brilliant, David. As always, it's been a pleasure listening to you. And we would be playing this to the audience. And if you are able to, at that point in time, come on live, we would certainly very much love to have you there and to be able to add your wisdom to the conversation. So as of now, with my pleasure, we'll let you go. Thank you.